Hey there. Tonight we are following a line of stone into one of the oldest quiet mysteries on Earth. In the riverland between the Tigris and Euphrates, long before iron, long before cranes, long before engineers carried polished instruments and hard hats and very serious coffee habits, enormous stones were somehow lifted, guided, and seated with a calm precision that still makes modern people blink twice. At Uruk, at Eridu, on platforms rising out of wet, alluvial ground, blocks weighing many tons were set into place as if someone had already taught the builders where weight wanted to go, how force could be persuaded, and how a city should rise before a city had any right to know such things. If that is exactly the sort of old puzzle you like to sink into at night, give the video a like, subscribe too, and stay with me by the fire, because the stones only grow stranger the longer we sit beside them. Now let the room dim a little. Let your breathing become quiet without making a performance out of it. Just settle and let the first temple come out of the dark. I have always thought that some mysteries improve when you stop trying to make them loud. Big claims tend to become silly when they are shouted. Stone does better than shouting. Stone waits. Stone keeps its own counsel. 5,000 years can pass over it like weather, and it still says, in the driest possible tone, look at the cut on this edge. Look at the weight of this block. Look at where I was placed. And then tell me again that nobody knew what they were doing. The land of southern Mesopotamia was not the obvious place for monumental stone mastery. That is part of what makes the problem so deliciously difficult. This was a country of mud, riet, river water, brick, bitumen, marshlight, and soft ground that remembered every footprint. A place where clay made sense. A place where baked brick made sense. Massive worked stone hauled from far away and lifted into elevated sacred structures. That is where the old comfort begins to slip. Picture the plain before sunrise. The air carries that cool river damp that disappears quickly once the sun climbs. Reeds murmur somewhere out in the margins. Mud sucks gently at sandals. Men move in low conversation, not because the work is easy, but because the day has only just opened and the full burden has not yet settled onto the back and shoulders. Then the structure ahead takes shape. A platform, a rising, sacred form. Courses of carefully placed material climbing above a world that ought to have remained low and wet. Even in imagination, it has the feeling of defiance. At Uruk, the White Temple sat on an artificial platform that turned flat land into sacred height. The source text presses on the same point again and again, and it is the right point to press. Height is easy to admire after it has been achieved. Height is harder to explain when the ground beneath you is marshy. Your materials are heavy. Your roads are uncertain. And your tools belong to an age we are often too quick to underestimate in the wrong ways and overestimate in the silly ones. There is a habit modern people have, a slightly smug habit, of imagining the ancient world as either primitive and fumbling or impossibly magical. Neither picture is very useful. The real unease lives in the middle. The Sumerians were not fools stacking random stones by instinct, and they do not need to become fantasy engineers with secret laser beams and pocket dimensions. What troubles the mind more is the thought that they may have been methodical enough, organized enough, mathematically disciplined enough, and perhaps guided by traditions old enough, that their achievements only look impossible because we keep approaching them with the wrong emotional scale. That emotional scale changes quickly when weight enters the room. A stone block on paper is abstract. A stone block at your feet is something else entirely. 2 tons, 5 tons, 10 tons, 15 tons. Numbers like these do not merely describe matter. They describe labor, friction, rope strain, timber creak, coordination, the possibility of crushed feet, broken hands, failed lifts, and the kind of silence that falls over a work crew when everyone realizes the load is heavier than their confidence. You know that feeling when a piece of furniture turns out to be much heavier than it looked, and suddenly the whole cheerful plan becomes a negotiation with gravity. Now stretch that feeling across an entire civilization. Remove the luxury of modern machinery and set the work on wet ground beneath a hot sky. That is where the old Mesopotamian builders lived, and yet they raised platforms. They aligned corners. They seated foundation elements with care so exact that later excavators, dusty and skeptical, and measuring everything because that is their particular love language, found themselves confronted with tolerances that do not fit comfortably inside the lazy modern story about what early Bronze Age people should have been able to manage. The city of Uruk, often called the first true city, is one of those places where history seems to wake up too quickly. It does not feel like a village slowly learning to stand. It feels like complexity arriving already dressed for the occasion. Administrative order, sacred hierarchy, labor organization, monumental architecture, all of it moves into view with unnerving confidence. That confidence matters. It is not just that stones were moved. It is that stones were moved inside a system capable of planning routes, allocating labor, sequencing construction, standardizing materials, and preserving enough knowledge for repeated success. If you were standing near the building works, the scene would not be cinematic in the modern cheap sense. No triumphant soundtrack. No heroic speeches about progress. It would be more interesting than that. It would be repetitive, methodical. 1,000 acts of attention so ordinary that each one alone would seem forgettable. Men checking surfaces, measuring by hand and rod, vetting rope, adjusting rollers, packing ground, listening for command, looking at the stone, then at the platform, then back at the stone again, with the expression of someone calculating risk in his bones. That is the atmosphere the story needs. Not fantasy noise. Controlled effort. The source transcript also keeps returning to the simple but devastating fact of distance. The stones did not spring from the temple courtyard like obedient vegetables. They had to come from somewhere. Quarry sites lay far away, over terrain that was not built for casual transport of concentrated mass. Once you start tracing the route in your mind, the mystery opens wider. Quarry, extraction, surface preparation, hauling, water crossings, temporary road reinforcement, finalasin, placement. Each stage contains its own opportunities for failure. and yet the projects were completed. Honestly, one of the darkest little truths in ancient engineering is that success leaves a cleaner record than failure. We admire the raised platform. We do not hear the swearing, the delays, the broken equipment, the arguments, the bruises, the days when the thing refused to move no matter how many men leaned into rope and timber. But you can feel those missing moments if you slow the scene down enough. That is where sleep storytelling becomes useful. It lets the practical ache return. Imagine a prepared road across unstable ground, bundled reed matting beneath, timber laid out to spread weight, men stepping around the rollers with the instinctive caution of people who know one bad angle can ruin an afternoon or a life. A foreman watching the tilt of the load, not dramatically, just intently. A little bronze tool hanging from his belt. A plumb line moving almost invisibly. The smell of damp fiber and bitumen. The stone inching forward with a sound like a low complaint from the earth itself. This is not impossibility. It is discipline made visible. And then there is the platform. Height is a second mystery, layered over weight. It is one thing to drag mass across distance. It is another to raise it and seat it accurately above the plain. The White Temple did not only need material, it needed sequence. Earthwork below. Fill. Compaction. Facing material. Foundation preparation. Drainage logic. Surface correction. The further one goes, the more each answer generates a new technical question behind it. This is where the old anxiety enters. Not fear of monsters, fear of competence that arrives too early. I have always found it strange that whole civilizations can look more unsettling when they are calm than when they are dramatic. The Sumerians do not leave behind the feeling of chaotic genius. They leave behind the feeling of procedures already known. That is what gives the stones their cold aftertaste. When a structure fits too well, when a platform rises too cleanly from bad ground, when heavy blocks arrive where they should not easily have arrived, the mind starts asking whether the builders were experimenting, or whether they were following methods that had already been refined long before the surviving temple took shape. That question is the true hook. Not simply how did they move the stones, but what kind of world produces builders who seem to know, from the beginning, more than we expect them to know. The answer may be entirely human. Passion, observation. Repeated trial. Organized labor. Early mathematics. The source text allows that possibility enough to stay honest. But it keeps another possibility alive too, not as loud spectacle, but as a buried current. The Sumerians themselves often said that the knowledge of civilization, building, measuring, ordering, came to them through divine instruction, through the beings later grouped under the name Anunnaki. That question will come later in full, and it should. For now, it is enough to feel the first pressure of it in the stone itself. A raised temple is a kind of argument. It says, we knew where this should go. By now, the listener should almost be able to feel the grain of limestone under the fingers, the chalky dryness of a worked face, the small ridge where tool met surface and corrected it one careful pass at a time. Let the eye travel along a joint. Let the tiny gap, or near absence of one, become its own sort of hush. A close fit is one of the oldest beautiful things humans can make. Two heavy things persuaded into agreement. No boasting, just contact. There is a little humor in all this too, and it helps. Modern people love to say ancient builders lacked this or lacked that, as if history were a long series of deficiencies waiting for us to fix them. Meanwhile, those same ancient builders are out there in mud and reed country, raising elevated, sacred complexes, while many of us today struggle to assemble a bookshelf without an emotional event. It is useful to remain humble in the presence of old competence. Still, humility alone is not enough. The next layer of the mystery waits beneath the stone. Because once you accept that the temples rose through highly organized effort, another question appears. The stones are not isolated marvels. They belong to cities supported by canals, gradients, drainage systems, and planned layouts. In other words, the true wonder may not be that a few heavy blocks were lifted. The true wonder may be that the entire landscape around them was already being managed with a level of precision that makes the stones feel like only the most visible tip of a much older intelligence at work. So let the platform remain in your mind for a moment longer. Let the first city keep its shape in the dark. The stones have risen. The problem is now larger, because once a civilization can do this, we have to ask what else it knew, what it knew about water, measurement, and planned urban life, and whether the blocks on the platform were only the visible signature of a far deeper engineering confidence moving quietly beneath the marshland. Once the stones are in place, the eye naturally follows the city around them, and that is where the puzzle becomes harder, not easier. A temple platform can be admired as an isolated achievement if one wishes to stay comfortable. But the Sumerian world did not produce isolated achievements. It produced systems, canals stretching across flat country with gradients so slight they feel almost impossible to hold over long distance. Streets and drainage planned with a seriousness that suggests somebody cared deeply about what happened beneath the feet as much as what rose above the head. Standardized bricks, coordinated kilns, administrative oversight, surveying, water control. The stones begin to look less like miracles and more like signatures of a civilization already thinking in technical wholes. If you walk out from the temple and into the wider plain in your imagination, the first thing you notice is how little generosity the land offers on its own. Southern Mesopotamia could be fertile, wonderfully fertile, but it was never simple. Water had to be invited, guided, restrained, and corrected. Too little, and the fields failed. Too much, and the land drowned in its own abundance. Silt had to be managed. Channels had to remain clear. Levels had to be judged with care subtle enough to make modern people, who have laser survey tools and still manage to make a mess of things, feel a little less superior for a while. The source text points to canal systems hundreds of kilometers long, with gradients so slight that a casual glance across the landscape would never tell you the full story. That is what makes hydraulic engineering in Sumer so intimate. It hides in calm surfaces. A river plain can look almost level to the eye. Water knows better. Water always knows better. Give it the smallest excuse, the faintest slope, the slightest weakness in a bank, and it chooses its own direction with the patience of a creature that has outlived every argument against it. So imagine a surveyor in that world. No polished modern instrument in his hand. No convenient digital display. No cheerful satellite whispering coordinates from above. Used rods, cords, plumb lines, calibrated habit, memory, and a way of looking that has been trained to detect what ordinary sight misses. The land shimmers under heat. Insects hover near the wet margins. Mud holds yesterday's footprints. He pauses, looks, measures, looks again. Water will later obey or betray what he understands in this moment. That is the quiet drama of hydraulic knowledge. Most of the triumph happens before anyone sees it. I have always thought canals are among the most poetic things engineers make, though engineers themselves are often too decent to say such extravagant things aloud. A canal is a sentence written for water. Too steep, and the sentence becomes a scream. Too flat, and it dies in the throat. Sumerian builders somehow learned to write long, persuasive sentences across the plain, guiding flow across distances that should have defeated lazy measurement. That is not merely hard work. It is geometry with consequences. The old records and archaeological surveys suggest that these canals did more than move water from one place to another. They included gates, overflow pathways, settling basins, corrections for silt, and all the modest, unglamorous wisdom that separates a system from a ditch. I love that detail because it removes the last refuge of romantic simplicity. It is one thing to dig a trench. It is another to understand that a trench living with water becomes a changing problem. A conversation that must continue through seasons, sediment, and flood moods. The Sumerians appear to have understood that conversation very well. If you were standing near one of those channels at dusk, you might hear the soft shift of controlled water moving past reed and bank. Nothing heroic, just flow under discipline. A gate somewhere slightly open. A change in current near a basin built to catch heavy silt before it could travel farther into the system. Mud settling slowly where someone long ago had wanted it to settle. That kind of success is almost invisible once it works, which is why good engineering so often looks like nature behaving itself. And then there are the cities. Uruk, Nippur. Later Babylon through layered inheritance. Streets laid out with intention. Residential zones, commercial zone, sacred precincts, drainage beneath. Multi-story houses in some places, built from standardized brick sizes that tell the same story again and again. Somebody was measuring. Somebody was controlling production. Somebody cared that one brick matched another closely enough for planning and strength. Standardization is one of the least romantic words in the language, and one of the most revealing. It means the civilization has moved beyond improvisation into reproducible order. You know that feeling when you open a drawer and find that everything inside has been sorted, labeled, and cut to fit. There is a relief in it, even if it makes you feel slightly judged. Sumerian urban life has some of that feeling. The more archaeology uncovers, the more the cities seem arranged by minds that disliked waste, disliked inconsistency, and trusted rule, measure, and repeated form. Even the houses speak the language of planning. This is where the story turns away from the sheer glamour of big stones and enters something darker and more persuasive. Cities that breathe through drainage channels. Streets laid where runoff has been considered. Foundations adapted to unstable alluvial soils. Brick dimensions controlled. Kiln outputs coordinated. A monumental structure at the center is impressive. Yes, but the hidden systems surrounding it are the real proof of maturity. Only a civilization already comfortable with logistics can make hidden systems this well. Honestly, I have always found drainage more frightening than towers. Towers can be built by ambition. Good drainage requires foresight. It means the builders knew what filth, storm, overflow, and gravity would do if ignored. It means they accepted that urban life produces hidden consequences. And it means they built for those consequences before failure forced humility upon them. Imagine a street after heavy seasonal water. The surface glistens under weak morning light. Doorways are damp at the threshold. Somewhere a woman lifts a hem to avoid the worst of the mess. Somewhere a child tries very hard to step where he was told not to step. Beneath the street, however, a channel carries away what would otherwise rot the city from below. Most people passing over it will not think about the slope of that channel or the size of the opening that prevents blockage. They will simply live their lives inside the success of someone else's care. That is what advanced engineering often feels like to ordinary people. Not marvel. Reliability. The source transcript also presses on mathematical sophistication, and it belongs here because the city itself becomes a kind of proof that abstract knowledge had entered practical life. The sexagesimal system, later used so powerfully in mathematics and astronomy, did not float above the built environment as a decorative intellectual toy. It mattered on the ground. Measurement, proportion, repeated units, spatial planning, time allocation for labor. All of it leaned on numerical habit. A civilization does not standardize bricks and maintain long canal gradients by intuition alone, no matter how flattering we may find that word. This is one of those moments where the old archive and the excavated city begin to speak in the same voice. The tablets tell us about management, records, allocation, and technical concerns. The ground tells us that those concerns were not imaginary. The fit between text and ruin is one of the strongest quiet thrills in ancient history. It means the dead were not merely telling stories about themselves. They were leaving behind a working method. By now, the listener should be able to sense the city as a whole organism. The temple platform high above. The administrative rooms with their clay records. The kilns where bricks were fired in repeated size. The canal lines feeding the fields and supplying the urban core. The drains under the streets. The labor crews. The inspectors. The tool inventories. The food rations. A city is a body. And Sumerian cities feel like bodies whose organs had already been named and coordinated. That coordination also creates a new emotional problem. If the built world was this systematic so early, how fast did that competence emerge? Did it grow very gradually from generations of trial and correction? That is entirely possible. Did it arrive in clusters? With certain principles already in place, by the time the cities reached the scale we can excavate. Also possible. And then the old texts add their own whisper. The claim that the crafts of civilization, measuring, building, ordering, were taught by beings the Sumerians considered more than human. You do not need to swallow that whole to feel its attraction here. When competence appears too mature too soon, teaching becomes a powerful explanation. If you were a later Sumerian looking back on the first great cities, you might genuinely conclude that such knowledge could not have begun with ordinary men poking at mud until enlightenment accidentally happened. You might say the gods showed us. You might say Enki made the order of the world clear. You might say the great beings established the first patterns, and humans copied them into earth, brick, and stone. That would not be stupidity. That would be a civilization trying to explain the force of its own inheritance. There is a small joke hiding in the details too, and I cannot resist it. Our modern age loves to imagine itself as the one finally serious about infrastructure. Then we wander into ancient Mesopotamia and find people in reed country carefully grading long canals and building urban drainage, while half the modern world cannot keep one season of road work from turning into a national personality trait. The old world was not modern, of course, but it was very far from careless. What I want the listener to feel at the end of this movement is a shift in scale. The mystery is no longer just about lifting stones. It is about a civilization whose visible achievements stand on hidden systems. The hidden systems stand on measurement. Measurement stands on written knowledge. Written knowledge, in the Sumerian imagination, often stands on transmitted order. The farther down you go, the less accidental the whole landscape begins to seem. So let the water remain in the mind for a moment. The almost level plain. The channel carrying flow where none should travel so obediently without help. The city above its drains. The kiln bricks repeating their dimensions. The temple platform watching over all of it like the visible crest of a much larger technical mind. The next thing we need now is to go inside the archives themselves, where tablets preserve tolerances, calculation, and technical language precise enough to make the engineering no longer a matter of admiration alone, but of written evidence pressed into clay by people who expected their knowledge to survive. The deeper this story goes, the less it depends on imagination, and the more it begins to depend on records. Ruins can impress anyone. A high wall, a fitted block, a canal that still remembers its line through the land. These things have a way of winning admiration very quickly. But admiration is soft. Clay records are harder. A block in the ground can make you wonder. A tablet in a dim archive can make you admit that the builders were not merely strong or patient, but deliberate. This is where the old tablet rooms begin to matter more than the monuments. Picture one of them slowly. Not a grand hall full of theatrical shadows, but a practical room with shelves, baskets, trays, and stacks of baked clay, keeping their patient little silence. The air is dry. Dust sits in corners like a second history. Light from a lamp or a narrow opening brushes the edges of wedge marks. Somewhere outside, a cart moves. An animal calls. Somebody argues about grain or wages or a door that should have been repaired 2 weeks ago. Inside, however, the city becomes thought made durable. the source material moves here for exactly the right reason. The stones and canals are impressive, but the real chill arrives when measurement begins to speak. Administrative tablets, mathematical exercises, allocation records, work tallies, dimensions, radios. All of it adds up to the same unsettling mood. These builders were not feeling their way through darkness. They were operating inside systems of number, sequence, and repeatable practice. One of the most striking examples is the old Babylonian mathematical tradition, which preserves habits of thought already rooted in the Sumerian world beneath it. The tablet, known as Yale Babylonian Collection 7289, has become famous because it reveals a geometrical sophistication that seems almost unfairly early. A square is drawn. A diagonal is calculated. The relation between side and diagonal is preserved in sexagesimal notation with astonishing precision. It is such a quiet little object, and yet it carries the kind of intelligence that makes later arrogance look very young. The people who wrote on clay in these rooms understood abstract relation, not merely rough counting. I have always found that more eerie than giant stones. Weight can be bullied by enough hands. Geometry cannot. Geometry has to be understood. Imagine a scribe in training, seated cross-legged on a floor that remembers thousands of similar bodies over generations. In front of him is damp clay, firm enough to receive a neat impression, soft enough to forgive a small hesitation. His stylus hovers. A teacher watches. The problem is not heroic. It is simple. Length, width, area, ratio. Yet behind each simple exercise, there waits the whole hidden skeleton of a built world. A correct line on clay becomes a correct angle in timber. A correct ratio becomes a stable platform. A correct volume becomes enough brick, enough bitumen, enough labor days, enough food rations not to strand a work crew in heat and mud. That is what tablets do to ruins. They turn admiration into procedure. Then there is the notorious tablet called Plimpton 3-2, another quiet little slab that keeps causing polite trouble in modern minds. It preserves sets of numbers whose relationships suggest a deep working knowledge of what later ages would call Pythagorean triples. One can argue about exact interpretation, and scholars do, as scholars should. Some argue the tablet was a teaching tool. Some say it helped with surveying. Some see it as part of broader mathematical tradition, not yet fully understood. We cannot be sure of every classroom scene that surrounded it. What we can be sure of is the mood. The mood is not primitive. The mood is exact. You know that feeling when somebody explains a difficult thing too clearly for you to keep pretending they got lucky. That is the feeling these tablets create. And the mathematics does not sit alone in some ivory tower of cleverness. It lives beside texts about workers, brick output, grain allocation, and construction tasks. This is one of the most important emotional truths in the whole story. The builders did not separate pure thought from heavy labor, the way modern people sometimes do when they are being snobbish in very boring ways. Number and mud live together. Ratio and rope live together. The archive understood perfectly well that a city rises when thought is translated into repeated physical acts. The source transcript keeps returning to tolerances. And that is worth dwelling on because tolerances are among the least romantic and most revealing signs of serious engineering. A civilization that worries about tolerance is a civilization that expects materials to fit. It expects walls not to wander. It expects courses to align. It expects drainage gradients not to fail because somebody shrugged at a finger width that looked close enough. Tolerance is civilization admitting that the world punishes carelessness. If you were standing beside a block being prepared for placement, perhaps on the edge of a platform fill where workers have already packed layer over layer beneath, the final few moments before the stone settles would feel almost sacred in the most practical way. Dust on the surface, a cord stretched, a measuring rod lifted. Someone kneels to look along an edge. Someone else checks level by eye and by line. The stone lowers with a deep, slow certainty. Not yet. A correction. A fraction. A little more. Then it seats. That tiny pause after seating. When no one speaks, yet because everyone is listening for whether the world approves, that pause is the sound of tolerance becoming reality. Honestly, I think the silence after a good fit must have felt glorious. The archive lets us infer that such moments were not accidents. Lists of standardized bricks, repeated units, grain payments to labor groups, records of deliveries. All of these are dull in the best possible way. Dullness is evidence of routine, and routine is evidence of mastery. When a culture has moved beyond heroic one-off achievements and into repeated controlled output, the records become boring because the miracles have become workflow. There is something darkly funny in that. Future people stare in wonder at ancient engineering, and the ancient engineers themselves are busy complaining about inventory, labor shares, damaged supplies, and who forgot the proper sequence for drying the latest batch of bricks. The archive never flatters the modern craving for drama. It keeps reminding us that excellence often wears the face of administration. And still, the mathematics hums beneath it. The sexagesimal system, inherited and elaborated in Mesopotamia, is part of why these records feel so mature. Base 60 is not the sort of thing a culture stumbles into casually and then just happens to use brilliantly for measuring time. Angles and portions. It is one of those old structures that makes later achievement look smoother because the numerical language itself is suited to division and relation. The same civilization that later gives us the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle was already training minds to think in divisible wholes. And those habits could move easily from astronomy to land, measurement to construction planning. If you were a foreman with a clay tablet in hand, you would not think in abstract glory. You would think in counts. So many bricks. So much fill. So many men. So many days. So much rope. So much wood. Such and such a width at the base. Such and such a narrowing at the top. There is a stern comfort in that way of thinking. The world becomes manageable because it can be parceled, compared, and corrected. No wonder the cities feel planned. They were imagined by minds accustomed to partitioning complexity. This is also where the story becomes human in a way I like very much. We speak about Sumerian technology as though the people involved were a single anonymous civilization moving like one giant mind. but the tablets restore the smallness inside the greatness. Individual scribes, teachers, apprentices, account keepers, inspectors, delivery men, skilled cutters, brick makers, water managers, men arguing over short shipments, men trying very hard not to be blamed for something that is obviously going to collapse if the next stage begins too soon. That human texture matters because it prevents the story from becoming cold in the wrong way. Advanced knowledge does not float above life. It moves through hands, tempers, mistakes, corrections, and repeated training. I have always thought that one of the most beautiful things about cuneiform is how physical it is. Knowledge is not hidden in some weightless realm. It is pressed. You can almost feel the moment of thought turning into matter. Each wedge is a tiny force event. The stylus enters, leaves, enters again. A count is preserved. A ratio is preserved. A judgment is preserved. A city gets to remember what it learned because somebody kept pressing carefully enough. And the more such pressing accumulates, the less plausible pure improvisation becomes. A canal gradient here, a standard brick there, a diagonal relation on one tablet, labor accounts on another, a foundation deposit naming what was built and for whom. Piece after piece. The archive creates not a romance of primitive genius, but a civilization of method. That may be the strongest thread in the whole source script. The wonder is not that the Sumerians sometimes did clever things. The wonder is that their cleverness appears systematic from very early on. Some listeners may already be thinking ahead to the larger claim, the one about the Anunnaki teaching the arts of civilization. We are not there fully yet, but the path toward it is now visible. When a culture achieves technical maturity this early, and then repeatedly says that knowledge was given, not merely discovered, the statement no longer sounds like decorative piety. It begins to feel like a genuine explanation offered by the people inside the tradition. Perhaps they were wrong. Perhaps they were expressing memory in mythic language. Perhaps they were preserving something stranger. But the claim can no longer be brushed aside as the excuse of people who did not know what they were doing. The tablets prove they knew a great deal. That is the crucial turn. These were not ignorant people inventing divine teachers because they could not comprehend engineering. These were engineering people, organized people, mathematical people, who still said the ordering knowledge came from beyond them. Let that sit for a moment beside the fire. The archive room is dim. Rows of clay sleep in their shelves. Outside, the city makes its old restless sounds. Inside, a young scribe finishes a calculation and places the tablet aside for drying. He has not raised a stone himself today. He has not graded a canal. He has not packed the substructure beneath a temple platform. Yet he has helped the city hold its shape because he has kept the numbers from dissolving. It is almost tender, that kind of importance. Quiet people saving large things by pressing signs into mud. And now the pressure of the mystery changes again. The calculations and records have done their work. They have shown us that the builders possessed formal technical intelligence. The next step is to follow that intelligence back into the material world itself. into quarry faces, bronze edges, rollers, bogus, timber roads, rope strain, and the long practical violence by which heavy stone is persuaded to travel from one landscape into another. The tablets tell us the mines were ready. The next question is how those mines made the ground obey. Once the tablets have convinced you that the Sumerian builders were thinking clearly, the next thing the imagination wants is not more number, but more friction. How did those thoughts become movement in the world? How did a block in a quarry become part of a temple platform far away across bad ground? How did the stone leave the parent rock, survive transport, and arrive fit enough to sit among measured companions without turning the whole enterprise into a slow public disaster? This is where the story becomes almost bodily. The quarry is a harsher place than the archive, and perhaps because of that it feels a little more honest. No elegant calculations floating behind lamplight now. Just open rock, dust in the air, noise, repetition, and the patience required to break matter without ruining it. The source text gives this section its full weight because it understands something important. The mystery of ancient building is not just about vision. It is about contact. Picture a quarry at dawn. The sky still pale. The stone face holding last night's coolness a little longer than the ground below. Men move toward it carrying bronze tools, wooden mallets, wedges, baskets, cords. Nothing here is theatrical, and yet the mood has its own solemnity. Everybody knows the block has weight before it is free. Everybody knows a wrong strike can create a fracture line that will turn weeks of labor into bitter lesson. There is no room for dreamy symbolism here. Only listening. Listening matters more than people expect. The source transcript makes a point about acoustic testing, and it is one of those details that sounds almost mystical until you realize it is simply skilled attention. Tap stone. Hear the answer. A good block speaks differently from a flawed one. Tiny internal weaknesses reveal themselves through tone before they reveal themselves through ruin. I love that. It means the quarry is partly a place of sound. The men are not only striking, they are hearing. If you were there, the air would be full of different notes. A dead little knock from bad stone. A sharper response from a promising face. Bronze on rock. Dust settling. Somebody muttering an opinion. Somebody else trying the same spot again to be sure the first ear was not lying. It is a very human scene. Expertise, in the old world as now, often looks like people standing around a difficult object, making skeptical noises until a method emerges. Then comes the controlled fracture. Bronze wedges driven in sequence. Hammering not random, but patterned. Pressure distributed along a line the workers want the stone to respect. The whole process is a negotiation. Stone is being persuaded to obey a plan without shattering beyond use. That is a lovely little metaphor for civilization itself, though I promised not to wander too far into decorative thinking, and I should keep my promise. Still, the emotion of it matters. A great block loosening is not merely extraction. It is release under discipline. The quarry is only the beginning. Once free, the block becomes a transport problem, And transport is where ancient engineering begins to feel truly grand. Because a block that weighs several tons does not care how noble the destination is. It cares about slope, support, contact surface, moisture, drag, and the courage of the people foolish enough to place their bones near it. The old records and archaeological reasoning suggest combinations of rollers, timber sledges, rope systems, reinforced roads, and water transport where possible. Nothing magical, which is precisely why the result feels more, not less, astonishing. You know that feeling when something heavy has to move and every person nearby grows more polite because gravity is the only authority in the room that nobody can bluff. That is transport. Imagine the path prepared ahead of the block. Timber laid over unstable sections. Reed bundles packed where ground is too soft. Men hauling. Others guiding the rollers beneath. Others handling rope to prevent dangerous swing. One or two watching the entire line with the stern face of people who have seen what happens when confidence outruns control. Sweat gathers quickly once the sun rises. Dust sticks to skin. The block creeps. Not elegantly. Not quickly. It moves with the deep, rude slowness of weight, accepting no lies. There is something deeply soothing in that slowness, if you let it be. The stone does not hurry because it cannot. The men around it cannot afford fantasy. Every movement is honest. Pull. Pause. Reset. Check. Pull again. Good engineering often feels like humility, repeated until the thing finally works. The source material also stresses the role of water, and rightly so. Mesopotamian builders had rivers, canals, bahaghis, and all the associated headaches. A river is a gift for transport if the load can be brought to it, stabilized on it, and taken off again without catastrophe. That last part is where the real art begins. Loading a heavy block onto a barge is not the sort of problem that yields to optimism. It yields to ramps, balance, counterpull, timbers that do not split at the wrong moment, and men whose understanding of load shift is already living in the muscles long before anyone writes a treatise about it. If you stand by the riverbank in your mind, the whole scene becomes vivid. Wet wood, rope dark with moisture, bitumen smell rising from treated surfaces, a hull waiting lower in the water than you would like, men calling short instructions, the block inching down a ramp, the river pretending innocence while fully prepared to punish carelessness. Then at last the load settles. Not gracefully, perhaps, but securely enough. A little relief passes through the crew like cooler air. I have always thought that the true romance of ancient engineering is relief, not triumph. Relief. And yet even river transport only solves part of the route. The block must still arrive. It must be offloaded. It must be dragged or rolled or levered into final approach. The platform or temple foundation must be ready to receive it. That readiness is easy to forget. The receiving site is itself an engineering condition. Layers of fill must be compacted. The bearing surface must be corrected. Access must remain possible long enough for the final stages. A stone cannot simply appear where it belongs. the world around it must be prepared to deserve it. This is where timber frameworks begin to haunt the imagination. Not preserved whole, because wood dies and disappears, but implied by the tasks themselves. Frames, ramps, braces, cribbing, lifting aids, temporary support elements. Ancient machinery has a habit of vanishing and leaving only achievements behind, which is a little unfair and wonderfully eerie. A modern person sees the stone in place and forgets the forest that may once have held it in the air, one cautious finger width at a time. Honestly, vanished wood is one of the great ghosts of archaeology. The source transcript also nudges toward bronze fittings, bearings, and hardware, and here caution is wise. Some proposals are stronger than others. Some modern reconstructions overreach because people get a little too excited when the past behaves competently. We cannot fill every missing gap with whichever clever mechanism makes the story most satisfying. But neither should we underestimate what a people with bronze tools, rope technology, timber knowledge, and generations of accumulated practice could devise. Heavy lifting does not require an industrial skyline. It requires method. A final placement scene is worth lingering over because it contains so much of the whole mystery in miniature. The block has arrived after distance, dust, river danger, and labor. Now it hangs or rests in temporary control near its final position. Ropes are taut. Timbers complain softly under strain. A foreman squints along an edge. Someone kneels to inspect the bedding surface. A small correction is made with a lever. Another. No hurry. No speeches. Just the old, almost sacred patience of people who know that once the stone settles badly, all later beauty becomes repair. Then the block goes home. That homecoming sound would have been magnificent in the smallest way. A low contact, a dull settling note, dust jumping from a seam. The silence after. In that silence you hear whether the work was worthy. It is one of the oldest verdicts in human life. Does it fit? The source story is strongest when it lets that question remain plain. Not how did magical beings cheat gravity. Not how did ignorant people accidentally get lucky. Just this. How did early builders, in a land not rich in easy stone and not kind to casual transport, repeatedly succeed at quarrying, moving, and placing heavy material inside organized sacred architecture? The answer is that they were far more technically mature than the lazy version of history allows. The darker possibility, the one waiting farther ahead, is that they themselves believed such maturity had been taught. There is a beautiful little human detail hidden in all of this too. Ancient labor is exhausting to imagine if you do it honestly. Shoulders burn, hands blister, feet ache. Dust enters the mouth and stays there. Tempers rise. Somebody always thinks there is a shorter way that would absolutely kill everyone if allowed. Somebody else insists on the proper sequence with all the charisma of a stone wall. A good crew survives not because it is heroic all the time, but because enough people trust procedure more than impulse. That truth belongs to every age. The quarry, the road, the barge, the ramp, the final bedding. These stages turn the Sumerian world into something wonderfully solid. We are no longer staring at abstract claims of greatness. We are walking beside weight. We are hearing bronze on stone. We are smelling river timber and dust. The city that will later appear serene and sacred is being assembled through acts of careful coercion against stubborn matter. And once that has been felt, another emotional door opens. Because the more convincing the practical engineering becomes, the more interesting the old claims of divine instruction become. The people who wrote of gods, teaching, measurement, and building were not speaking from helpless ignorance. They knew what real labor cost. They knew what real placement required. If they still said the arts of ordering, measuring, and raising belonged originally to higher beings, then perhaps they were preserving something more than decorative religion. Perhaps they were naming the source of a technical inheritance they themselves did not believe began with them. That question belongs to the next movement. We have now followed the stone from quarry to seat. We have heard the ring of tested rock and the groan of transport. We have felt the restraint of plausible, ancient method. The next step is to let the material world and the written world meet directly in sacred narrative, royal inscription, divine blueprints, and the persistent old idea that the first builders were not merely clever, but instructed. The more convincing the physical engineering becomes, the more dangerous the old sacred explanations start to feel. It is easy to smile at divine instruction when one imagines ancient people standing helplessly before a problem they could not solve. It is much harder to smile when the same people have already shown themselves capable of surveying canals, standardizing bricks, calculating diagonals, quarrying stone, managing labor, and preserving procedural knowledge in clay. At that point, when they say the arts of civilization were taught, the statement changes temperature. It stops sounding like an excuse and begins to sound like memory. This is why the source material turns back toward the Anunnaki and toward texts connected with Enki, temple foundations, and the ordering of the world. Once the practical world has been established, the sacred world no longer feels separate from it. The gods are not merely being thanked for nice weather and emotional support. They are being named as the original holders of craft, measure, and built order. The old Mesopotamian imagination does not flatter human pride. Again and again it says that the first patterns came from above, or from beyond, or from the deep places where higher intelligence kept its store of working knowledge. I have always found that deeply unsettling in a calm way, not because it proves anything dramatic in one stroke. It does not, but because it aligns too neatly with the evidence of early competence. The texts claim instruction. The ruins show competence. The tablets show procedure. The fit between those things is what keeps the mystery alive. Think for a moment about Enki, Lord of the Apsu, keeper of hidden wisdom, master of craft, measurement, language, and ordering intelligence. If the Mesopotamian world wanted to place technical knowledge under the care of one figure, it chose exactly the right one. Enki does not feel like raw force. He feels like stored capability. He is the god you would expect to understand gradients, vessel design, boundary stones, the relation between plan and execution. His sacred atmosphere is never merely emotional. It is practical, cool, and a little dangerous because he knows too much. In some texts, he distributes the me, the powers or ordered capacities that make civilization possible. That phrase can sound abstract if one hears it lazily, but the more you sit with it, the less abstract it becomes. The me include kingship, craftsmanship, judgment, writing, music, building, power, and the structuring elements that turn scattered humans into organized life. They behave less like vague virtues and more like packets of operating knowledge, almost like sealed permissions handed out to make a complex system run. There is something eerily modern in that idea, though it is also very old, and perhaps that is why it lingers. If you were standing in a temple court at dusk, waiting while priests brought out ritual objects associated with founding, measuring, and dedication, the emotional effect would not be childish at all. It would feel administrative in the deepest sacred way. The rod, the line, the boundary marker, the plan, the carefully prepared deposit set under a wall or platform. These things do not belong to a religion that treats building as accidental. They belong to a world that thinks construction echoes a prior order. The source transcript leans into this with royal inscriptions and foundation texts, and I think it is right to do so. Mesopotamian rulers did not normally describe themselves as wild inventors making things up as they went. They described themselves as restorers, rebuilders, executors of ancient plans, servants of divine instruction. They were forever reopening old temple sites, measuring against what came before, consulting inherited forms, and presenting their building work as obedience to something already established. That is important. It means even kings did not like to claim authorship too boldly. They preferred sanctioned continuity. That preference appears again and again in temple hymns and dedications. A sanctuary is not simply raised because a ruler wants prestige. It is raised according to divine favor, divine pattern, divine selection of place, and often through language that suggests blueprint rather than whim. The old city is full of rebuilding, but it is rebuilding with memory. Layer upon layer, shrine upon shrine, platform upon platform, always returning to the same sacred point. That is not random conservatism. It is the behavior of a civilization that thinks location, proportion, and authority were fixed rightly in the beginning and must be kept close to their original pattern. You know that feeling when someone repairs an old house and refuses to move one wall because that wall is somehow the truth of the whole building? The Mesopotamian sacred landscape often feels like that. Original placement matters. Ancient founding matters. The first measure matters. The builder is not free to improve on everything, because improvement is not the highest value. Correct continuation is. And then there is atrahasis again, which keeps returning because it contains more technical flavor than later readers are comfortable admitting. The flood vessel instructions are not poetry in the soft sense. They are specifications. Shape, sealing, materials, layering, practical survival design. If one wanted a clean example of sacred narrative carrying real engineering logic, it is difficult to find a better one. A crisis is coming. Enki does not offer abstract reassurance. He offers buildable information. Honestly, that may be the most important emotional clue in the entire archive. The divine figures who help humanity do so by transmitting usable knowledge. Not slogan, not merely blessings. Knowledge that has dimensions and sequence. Imagine the scene slowly. A warning whispered through reed, wall, or dream. The night very still. Water not yet risen, but somehow already present in the imagination. The chosen survivor holding the shape of the instructions in his mind, not fully understanding why these dimensions and not others. Why this sealing method? Why this preparation? And yet feeling the authority of the pattern as something beyond argument. If you were with me there, I think the strangest sensation would be how technical the fear becomes. Not fear of wrath only, but fear of forgetting one step, one ratio, one layer of bitumen, one needed support. This is why the colony interpretation, bold as it is, keeps pressing back into the room. If a civilization remembers itself as taught, and if its oldest surviving sacred narratives encode procedural knowledge in moments of foundation, survival, and building, then the claim of divine teachers no longer feels like a childish flourish. It begins to feel like the civilization's own best explanation for why its inherited competence seemed older than its remembered beginnings. There is a danger here, of course, and it is worth speaking softly about it. Modern people, once they catch a scent of mystery, often start inventing much louder machinery than the evidence requires. Secret anti-gravity devices, impossible alloys, lost ray tools, glowing engines hidden under ziggurats. That sort of thing rushes in whenever patience leaves the room. The source script is strongest when it resists that temptation. It does not need cartoon marvels. The real unease is subtler. The old texts preserve a memory that knowledge was handed down. The archaeology shows that the knowledge, however acquired, was serious. That is enough to keep the story standing. If you were a Sumerian scribe or priest looking back on the first great temple builders, how would you describe them? Would you say they slowly muddled toward excellence through countless anonymous errors? Perhaps not. Perhaps you would say the gods taught them where the first line should be drawn, where the first city should stand, how the first house of heaven should be raised out of mud and stone. That description might be theological. Yes. It might also be the only language available for inherited expertise that already felt older than anyone alive could fully explain. The image of divine blueprints has always appealed to me for that reason. Not literal paper plans in a modern folder. Of course. Something older. A plan held in ritual, memory, dream, measured rod, repeated proportion. A plan that survives by being enacted, not just stored. When rulers rebuilt temples, they often acted as if the original measure still waited beneath the ruin, under dust and broken brick, asking to be found again. That is a haunting way to think about architecture. The right shape already exists. The builder only recovers it. And perhaps that is the quietest form of inheritance. Not being given every answer in explicit speech, but being taught the order of questions, the proper relation between line and load, wall and water, platform and sky. A builder taught that way could innovate. Yes, but within a grammar received from higher authority. The resulting city would feel old from its first mature form, because its logic would predate the particular hands carrying it out. I think that is why the source text circles so carefully around the Anunnaki, rather than using them as a cheap thrill. The point is not to turn them into monsters or magicians. The point is to preserve the Sumerian claim that higher beings possess the arts of civilization first. Once you accept how advanced the material record looks in practice, that claim acquires a gravity it would not otherwise have. It may still be myth. It may be encoded memory. It may be something stranger. But it cannot be dismissed as the speech of incompetence. By now, the listener should feel the pressure of two truths at once. On one side, human labor, skill, geometry, and organization can explain a great deal. On the other, the Sumerians themselves framed those very capacities as inherited from beyond ordinary humanity. Between those two truths, there is no need for panic, only for patience. A good night story lives exactly there, in the place where evidence and old memory sit together without fully solving one another. So let the temple stand again in the imagination. Its first stones already placed, its platform already corrected, the city around it breathing through canals and drains. Somewhere in a chamber nearby, a ruler receives or recites the divine sanction for what is being built. Somewhere else, a scribe records dimensions, offerings, and names. The sacred and the technical are not arguing. They are cooperating. That is the old world at its most unsettling and perhaps its most beautiful. The next step, naturally, is to return to the physical act of raising mass itself. But this time, with all of this new pressure behind it. Not just stone and labor, but possible inherited method. Not just frames and ropes, but systems of lifting that may have been more sophisticated than the surviving wood and fiber allow archaeology to show. The story now has to move into cranes, counterweights, suspended loads, and the slow, terrifying elegance of getting a giant block to rise without letting the world beneath it break. By the time a heavy block is ready for its final ascent, the entire problem of ancient engineering condenses into one image. Weight leaves the ground. That is the moment the imagination cannot fake very well. Dragging is one thing. Floating is another. The source text moves here with exactly the right sort of caution, because this is where enthusiasm often outruns evidence. We do not possess neat, preserved Bronze Age cranes sitting in a museum with a label that says, "There you are. Mystery solved. Now, everybody go home." Wood vanishes. Fiber rots. Leather dries into nothing. A lifting machine can disappear almost completely and leave behind only the raised stone as its rude little signature. That is what makes this part of the story both dangerous and irresistible. If you imagine the building site at this stage, the atmosphere is all nerves and method. A platform edge waits above. The block rests below, already dressed, already measured, already difficult. Around it there is timber, rope, packed earth, perhaps a ramp, perhaps a framework, perhaps multiple stages of temporary support that will never survive into the final monument and so will never receive the admiration they probably deserved. A handful of men are not enough now. This is coordinated labor, and it has to move almost like a single animal if disaster is to stay away. I have always thought that heavy lifting is among the most honest things humans do. Once a load leaves the ground, boasting becomes very silly, very fast. The load does not care about your theories. It cares about balance, anchor points, friction, compression, and whether the people in charge are as competent as they think they are. That honesty is part of the beauty here. We are not in the land of abstraction anymore. We are in the kingdom of consequences. The source transcript suggests pulley-like systems, timber frameworks, counterweights, and other means of multiplying force. And none of that is unreasonable. Humans discover leverage early because leverage is almost impossible not to notice. If you spend enough time moving things, you would rather not move. A long beam under a load teaches its lesson very quickly. A rope looped around a support teaches another. Stacked supports, cribbing, ramps, sledges, rollers, wedges, counterbalancing masses. All of these belong naturally to a world of practical intelligence. The question is not whether ancient people understood basic mechanics. They did. The question is how far that understanding had been systematized in Sumer, and how much vanished organic evidence once stood behind the results still visible today. Imagine a timber frame raised around a stone, not as some enormous theatrical machine with decorative wheels, but as a stern, temporary skeleton. Wood upright against the sky, cross members lashed or fitted, ropes running over smooth contact points that reduce abrasion, men at one side hauling in rhythm, others managing the slack, others guiding the stone with secondary lines to stop rotation. A supervisor watching with the kind of concentrated hatred of error that all good builders eventually acquire. The block rises not quickly, but enough. A hand width, then another. A support inserted. The load rests. The crew breathes. Another sequence begins. That stop and start rhythm matters. Ancient lifting does not have to be one great continuous sweep to count as engineering. In fact, staged ascent may be the more likely reality. Rise. Secure. Rebuild support. Raise again. Shift the frame. Raise again. One could spend an entire day winning only a few hand widths against gravity, and still be progressing in a perfectly rational way. There is something almost monastic in that patience. You know that feeling when a difficult task becomes less about finishing and more about not making the next mistake. That is the feeling I imagine on those building grounds. There are hints in the wider Mesopotamian world that moving water and managed force were already deeply understood. Water-raising devices, balancing principles, tensioned systems, the logic of compound effort. All of these belong to societies that live by controlled flow and repeated load. Even if the exact form of early lifting machines remains partly hidden, the conceptual world capable of them is clearly present. A civilization that can grade long canals, standardize production, calculate geometric relations, and coordinate large labor groups does not stand bewildered before the simple fact that force can be redirected. The source text also mentions bronze components, hardware, and the possibility of bearings or fitted mechanical elements. Here, the best tone is careful respect. Some surviving bronze pieces from ancient sites clearly belong to fittings, tools, hinges, and structural devices. Whether specific pieces supported advanced lifting gear in every case is another matter. We should not become greedy with the evidence. Yet it is equally foolish to pretend that the absence of intact wooden machines proves the absence of machine thinking. Engineering often survives in the holes it left behind. A slot cut where a beam once sat. Wear marks on stone from repeated rope movement. Standardized holes for securing timber. Unexpectedly regular anchor points near heavy architectural elements. These are the small, ghostly clues of vanished mechanics. If you were an archaeologist dusting such surfaces under hard afternoon light, the feeling would be peculiar. Not certainty, not fantasy, but the sense of standing in the negative space of competence. Something was here. Something worked. The wood has gone. The thought remains. Honestly, vanished. Scaffolding may be one of my favorite ghosts in ancient history. Whole forests may have risen and disappeared around monuments, all their labor forgotten because success turned the temporary into invisible prehistory. The final wall stands serene, while the machinery that coaxed each block into place returns to soil and silence. There is a lesson in that too, though perhaps a slightly rude one. The world praises finished surfaces and forgets the exhausted intelligence that held them in the air. Let us slow the scene again. Noon heat presses down. Timber smells warm. Rope fibers bite the hands. Dust settles on damp skin. The block is halfway raised, and now the whole site feels held in one giant breath. Somebody at the anchors shifts his footing. Somebody above leans in with a guiding line and then thinks better of standing so close. A command comes, short and ordinary, not grand at all. Pull. Hold. Ease. Again. In such moments, all human history becomes tactile. Civilizations are not abstractions. They are sweaty people trying to move impossible things without dying. That is one reason I resist the temptation to make the story too mystical. The real ancient magic, if the word can be tolerated for one quiet second, is coordinated attention. 30 people pulling at the right time. One person reading balance correctly. Another placing a support exactly when needed. A foreman refusing the dangerous shortcut. That kind of attention can raise worlds. Still, the larger mystery remains because of how early and how repeatedly such competence appears. One successful lift could be luck and courage. A building culture is something else. When monuments, platforms, heavy foundations, and long-planned urban works appear together, the question of system becomes unavoidable. Did the Sumerians build their lifting wisdom entirely from generations of practical experiment? Very possibly. Did they themselves believe that the roots of such knowledge were older than any human workshop? Absolutely. That is what the sacred traditions keep telling us, gently and stubbornly. There is also a more subtle side to lifting, and the source text hints at it in quality control. Getting a block up is not enough. It must arrive without hidden fracture. It must meet the prepared surface correctly. It must align with what comes next. A damaged or poorly seated block can sabotage everything above it. That means the site required inspection, sequencing, and probably authority structures sharp enough to overrule haste. Ancient engineering is often imagined as raw labor. In truth, it is often the triumph of inspection over impatience. If you were standing beside the master builder at the last moment before a block settles into its place high above the plain, I suspect the dominant feeling would not be excitement. It would be suspicion. Is the bedding true? Is the edge clean? Is the rope taking strain evenly? Is the angle wandering? Is the frame still honest? Great builders trust method, but they do not trust the world. The world has to be checked. That constant checking is what links the machinery section back to the earlier tablet room. The same civilization that recorded numerical relations and labor allocations would naturally inspect fit, count stages, and standardize hardware where possible. The machinery, even where archaeologically incomplete, belongs to the same moral world as the mathematics. Nothing is left to blind hope that can be stabilized by repeatable method. I think that is why this part of the story feels so calming, despite the obvious danger of crushed limbs and snapped timber. It is danger contained by order. Sleep stories work strangely well with that mixture. The listener does not need the world to be safe. The listener only needs it to be structured. A giant stone hanging in the air is terrifying. A giant stone hanging in the air, under the control of people who know what each rope is doing, becomes something almost peaceful to watch. By the end of this movement, the stone should no longer feel simply heavy. It should feel relational. Rope to beam, beam to frame, frame to earth, earth to platform, platform to plan, plan to archive, archive to divine memory. Everything is linked. The load rises because a whole civilization has already learned how to think in systems. And that is exactly why the next stage of the story turns away from brute force and into subtler forms of design. Once the stone is raised and placed, what sort of space is being created? Not just a shelter, not just a monument, but a tuned environment of sound, proportion, and controlled experience. The old temples were not only strong, they may have been harmonized. Their chambers, surfaces, and ritual layouts suggest a level of sensitivity to resonance and form that makes the engineering feel even broader than weight and lift alone. The stones rise, yes, but they rise into spaces designed not only to stand, but to speak back. By the time the stones are finally seated, the city has already proven that it can move weight, hold water, calculate proportion, and preserve method. But the old Sumerian world was not satisfied with structures that merely stood. The source text turns here toward something subtler, and in some ways even stranger. The possibility that the great temple spaces were engineered not only for strength and height, but for sound, for resonance, for controlled experience, for the peculiar feeling that a room itself could become part of the ritual. I have always thought that the quietest mysteries are the ones that arrive after the heavy labor is done. A raised wall is impressive. A tuned chamber is unnerving. Weight belongs to muscle and planning. Resonance belongs to listening. And listening requires a different kind of intelligence. One that notices how sound lingers, how corners gather voices, how brick and plaster can make a note bloom or die. Once you begin to imagine Sumerian builders caring about that, the temple stops being only a shelter for ritual and begins to feel like an instrument. Picture the approach at dusk. The outer steps still radiate a little of the day's heat. The air above the platform is calmer than it was below, as if the city has fallen half a breath behind you. Oil lamps are being lit within. The first glow catches plaster and polished surfaces softly. Someone enters, and the sound of footsteps changes at once. Outside, the ground swallows sound. Inside, the room receives it. That difference is small, but it is one of the oldest forms of power. A building that changes the human voice changes the human mind. The source material suggests acoustic intention, and while some of those claims must remain cautious, the general direction is persuasive. Temple hymns from Mesopotamia are full of walls that answer, courtyards that amplify, sanctuaries that carry chant. One can dismiss such language as poetic if one likes, but poetry often grows out of repeated bodily experience. If generations of priests, singers, and listeners knew that certain chambers carried tone in unusual ways, of course, the praise language would remember it. Stone that sings may simply be stone that resonates more beautifully than expected. A ceiling that hears may simply be one that returns sound with strange generosity. The sacred description does not erase the physical one. It grows from it. If you were standing inside such a chamber while a low bronze tone was struck once, you would probably understand the attraction immediately. The note would leave the metal and travel outward in a clean circle, brushing wall, pillar, corner, and then returning altered, not broken, just made larger by the room itself. A singer entering after that would not sound alone. A chant would gather body. A prayer would seem to remain present longer than the human throat that gave it birth. That is an immense ritual advantage, and it does not require fantasy to appreciate it. It requires architecture tuned by repetition, by experiment, and by people attentive enough to notice what shape does to breath. You know that feeling when a room changes your voice and suddenly you speak more softly because the room feels as if it is listening back. Temple acoustics live in that feeling. There is also the matter of proportion. The old world rarely separated beauty from practical effect. Ratios could please the eye and alter the behavior of sound at the same time. A narrow chamber, a broader one, a curved corner, a stepped recess, a raised platform for singers. All of these shape what the ear receives. The source transcript leans toward the idea that the Sumerians understood such effects more deeply than we usually grant, and I think that is plausible. A civilization capable of tracking canal gradients and diagonal relations is certainly capable of noticing that one arrangement of walls serves chant better than another. Honestly, one does not need advanced equations to learn an acoustic truth. One needs repetition, memory, and enough reverence not to shrug when a space behaves differently. The Sumerians had all three. Imagine apprentices in a sacred precinct carrying out ordinary duties before the formal rites begin. A broom crossing the floor with a soft, scraping whisper. A vessel set down. A voice from the far side of the hall arriving with odd clarity. Another voice from a different angle, becoming strangely swallowed. Over time, these patterns stop being curiosities and become knowledge. Then knowledge becomes preference. Then preference becomes building habit. A later chamber is shaped a little differently because an earlier one taught the lesson. That is how technical culture often grows. Not in one dramatic breakthrough, but in remembered advantage. The source text also points toward harmonic relations. And here again, the wisest tone is quiet confidence rather than theatrical certainty. Mesopotamia possessed a musical tradition rich enough to make tuning and interval meaningful. Temple ritual depended on chant, recitation, measured voice, and instruments with resonance of their own. In such a world, it would be astonishing if builders had not noticed the relation between room shape and sonic effect. Some scholars will remain cautious about claiming deliberate harmonic engineering in every case, and that caution is fair. Still, the broad pattern holds. These were not societies indifferent to sound. They were saturated with ritual sound. And ritual sound rewards architectural intelligence very quickly. If you were seated beside a pillar during an evening recitation, the experience might feel almost supernatural without requiring anything supernatural at all. The chant begins low. The room catches it, softens it, returns it. Incense moves in a thin ribbon through lamplight. Somewhere outside, the city continues in all its ordinary human restlessness. But inside the chamber, a different law takes hold. Sound becomes slow. Time becomes layered. The voice seems older than the mouth producing it. A building that can do that earns sacred memory very easily. I have always thought that one reason ancient religion feels so convincing from the inside is because its spaces were often technically better than our stripped modern imaginations allow. A rite performed in a badly proportioned room remains only words. A rite performed in a chamber that carries light, tone, and silence in the right balance becomes bodily truth. The listener feels the order physically. The builders of such places are not only masons. They are choreographers of perception. That is why the old sacred architecture may matter more than the old doctrinal statements. Doctrine can be copied and misunderstood. A room teaches every time it is entered. The body learns before the mind has time to object. The floor level, the way the walls narrow or widen, the relation between dark and flame, the small delay in returning sound. These things persuade gently and repeatedly. A temple does not merely tell you that heaven is near. It makes nearness feel plausible. The source material's suggestion that some temple structures were aligned with both celestial and acoustic purpose is especially attractive because it fits the wider Sumerian habit of integrated design. They did not build in separate emotional compartments. Water logic, sacred geometry, labor allocation, astronomical observation, and ritual experience all belonged to one world. So why would sound be excluded? Why would a people who cared about measurement, repetition, and divine presence fail to care how a prayer moved through air? The answer, most likely, is that they did care. That care would have shown itself not only in major halls, but in thresholds, corridors, courtyards, and raised speaking points. A priest on one step may be heard differently than on another. A reader beneath a lintel may sound narrower than beside an open court. A singer near a plastered wall may gain warmth that disappears beside rougher surface. Over decades and centuries, such details become part of transmitted craft. No dramatic revelation is required. Only memory kept long enough to become custom. There is a little humor in this too, in a gentle way. Modern people often walk through old sacred sites, muttering that religion was all symbolism. Then clap once in the chamber and look startled when the room answers like a trained thing. Ancient builders would probably have found that reaction very amusing, and then perhaps a little insulting. But amusement aside, the larger point remains dark in the right way. Once a temple becomes a tuned environment, architecture itself begins to participate in authority. The sacred no longer depends only on what is said within the chamber. The chamber joins the speaking. And when that happens, the line between engineering and revelation becomes beautifully hard to draw. A divine world may feel present because the room has been made to magnify voice, shape silence, and hold the body in measured relation to sound and light. The effect is real whether or not one uses theological language to describe it. That also means the engineering culture behind such spaces was broader than weight and lift alone. The builders were not merely trying to defeat gravity. They were trying to create conditions. Conditions for awe. Conditions for memory. Conditions for repeating a ritual in a way that felt unchanged because the room itself stabilized the experience. In that sense, the architecture becomes a machine of continuity. And continuity has been one of the central themes of this whole story from the beginning. If you were standing beside the fire with me now, I think this is where the city would start to feel complete. The stones lifted, the canals aligned, the records pressed into clay, the plans remembered through sacred language, the chambers shaped to answer the voice. A civilization like this does not look like it is inventing itself for the first time. It looks like it is carrying forward a grammar already too mature to feel entirely young. That does not prove the most dramatic conclusions. It does not prove hidden supermachines or impossible visitors handing down blueprints from the sky in some noisy modern fantasy. But it does preserve the deeper unease. The Sumerians built with a confidence that appears startlingly early, and then they said that the highest forms of order had been taught. When one adds even the subtle engineering of sound and ritual space to the record, the claim becomes harder to laugh away. The next and final movement must therefore do something difficult. It must stay balanced without becoming dull, and bold without becoming ridiculous. We have to look at the traces of more overt machinery, the bronze fragments, the lost timber systems, the debated reconstructions, and then return to the only ending this kind of story deserves. Not a shouted certainty, but a quiet admission that the oldest builders on Earth may have inherited more than our comfortable history likes to admit, and that the stones still keep that possibility in their silence. The last part of a story like this should not try to corner the listener. Cornered people stop listening. Old mysteries do better when they are allowed to remain standing in the room, like a patient guest nobody fully understands. By now, we have followed the source material through stones, canals, mathematics, archives, quarry work, sacred blueprints, lifting systems, and tuned temple space. The pattern is broad enough to feel undeniable and still uncertain enough to remain alive. That is exactly where the ending should live. There are, after all, traces that suggest the Sumerian and wider Mesopotamian world may have possessed more mechanical sophistication than the surviving organic evidence lets us see clearly. Bronze fittings, worked components, structural sockets, wear patterns, repeated solutions to heavy lifting and load management that imply frameworks now gone. The source transcript reaches toward pulleys, counterweights, and crane-like systems. Some of those reconstructions are stronger than others. The honest thing is to say so. We do not have a complete preserved machine rising from the dust to declare the argument closed. Wood disappears. Rope disappears. Leather disappears. What remains is often the stone that was lifted, the hole that once held a beam, the polished groove where something moved again and again under strain, the bronze fragment whose full purpose has to be reconstructed from context and common sense. Archaeology is often like that. One does not receive a whole song. One receives the note that would not stop vibrating. I have always found that more haunting than total proof. Proof settles. Fragments linger. Imagine an excavator brushing away packed dirt from a small bronze piece no longer than a hand. It lies there with the same composure as the greater stones, not announcing itself, not glowing, just waiting for someone to ask the right question. Was it a hinga? A fitting? A bearing surface? A reinforcement point? Part of a tool? Part of a device? Alone it may say little. Beside the larger building evidence, however, it begins to hum. Because civilizations that repeatedly solve heavy engineering problems leave behind not only monuments, but habits of hardware. The source text is strongest when it refuses to become greedy. That matters more here than anywhere. Ancient engineering does not need impossible fantasy in order to be remarkable. If we become too eager, we lose the real achievement inside the noise. The real achievement is already enough to keep a mind busy all night. Monumental platforms on weak ground, long canal gradients, standardized production, advanced mathematics, coordinated logistics, tuned ritual space, practical knowledge preserved in administrative clay and remembered in divine language. That is already a civilization operating at a level most people do not instinctively associate with so early a date. Honestly, it is better than sensationalism. Sensationalism burns fast and leaves very little heat behind. Competence is slower. It enters the bones and stays there. So, let us return, not to the loudest claim, but to the strongest one. The Sumerians were genuinely advanced builders and organizers. Much of what they achieved can be approached within the limits of Bronze Age capability if one grants them intelligence, disciplina, and time. That concession alone is more generous than many popular retellings ever become. And it is warranted. They were not primitive amateurs waiting for our approval. They were serious people with serious methods. And yet, and this is the old little shadow that keeps following us from room to room, they themselves did not speak. as if all of that order began with human improvisation. They kept saying it was taught. They kept assigning the first structures of civilization to divine intelligence, to Enki, to the higher powers, to the Anunnaki. They remembered the arts of building, measuring, ordering, and founding as inheritances. That memory may be theological. It may be encoded cultural truth. It may be the last elegant wrapper around something more historical than we are comfortable naming. But whatever it is, it belongs to the evidence, not to the decorative fringe around the evidence. If you were a Sumerian builder, truly one of them, standing at the edge of a new temple foundation at first light, you would not think of yourself as inventing civilization. I suspect you would think of yourself as serving it, continuing it, aligning your hands with patterns older than your own memory. Perhaps that is why the old records carry such an absence of vanity. There is royal pride, yes, plenty of it. But beneath royal pride, there is obedience to form. Even kings present themselves as restorers of ancient plans. That is a very revealing instinct. Great cultures often brag about creation. Sumer so often speaks of restoration. You know that feeling when you repair something according to markings left by someone older and more skilled than yourself. The work is yours, but the intelligence guiding it is not entirely yours. There is humility in that, and also relief. The burden of invention becomes the responsibility of fidelity. I think that feeling may sit very close to the heart of the whole Mesopotamian building tradition. The fire in the room is low now, and this is the right time to let the first image return. A stone. Just a stone at first. Heavy, dry, almost dull to the eye until you look long enough. Then the line of a cut begins to matter. The seat of a joint begins to matter. The context begins to gather. A temple platform beneath. A city around it. Drains below. Canals farther out. Tablets in a storeroom. Work gangs on prepared roads. Priests in resonant chambers. Rulers claiming ancient sanction. A civilization of method. Suddenly, the stone is no longer only stone. It is compressed system. That is the word I keep returning to, because it feels truer than miracle and truer than myth in the lazy modern sense. System. The Sumerian world gives every impression of systemic intelligence. And when a system appears early, mature, and self-described as inherited, the possibility of instruction cannot simply be laughed off like a bad ghost story. It has to be held beside the archaeology and allowed to trouble it. There is one last mercy in taking that trouble seriously. It makes the ancient people larger, not smaller. Too often old civilizations are either pitied as primitive or romanticized as magical. Both responses are evasions. The better response is respect. Respect for their mathematical imagination. Respect for their labor discipline. Respect for their sacred seriousness. Respect for the fact that when they said the arts of civilization were given, they may have been telling us how advanced their own achievements felt from the inside. If you were with me beside the fireplace, perhaps this is where we would finally stop trying to solve every edge and simply let the oldest builders have their mystery back. Not a mystery of nonsense, but a mystery of scale. How much did they know? How early did they know it? How much of that knowledge was truly developed in slow human accumulation? And how much arrived in forms already refined enough that later generations remembered it as divine gift? The stones do not answer directly. They only continue standing in a manner that makes the question worth asking. The source transcript ends strongest when it allows that balanced unease to remain. Not everything claimed in the more excited corners of modern speculation deserves equal trust. Some reconstructions run ahead of what the surviving evidence can bear. That is fine. Ancient engineering does not need exaggeration to be impressive, but neither should caution be used as a broom to sweep away the old testimony that knowledge was inherited. The right response is not gullibility and not dismissal. It is sustained attention. Sustained attention is one of the gentlest forms of respect we can offer the dead. So let the city settle around you one last time. The marsh air outside, the slow gleam of canal water, the kiln smell drifting on warm dark, the platform rising, the chamber within it shaped for voice, the archive shelves holding numbers and names, a bronze fitting sleeping in earth, a vanished timber frame once holding impossible weight in patient stages, a ruler repeating that he rebuilt what had been ordained long before him, a priest speaking of Enki and the divine arts, a worker tightening rope, a scribe pressing wedges, all of them participating in one fact the modern mind still has trouble accepting. The first great builders were not merely feeling their way through darkness, whether they inherited that light entirely from human predecessors or from traditions later remembered as the Anunnaki, remains open. But the silence of the stones feels different once you know what the records say. It no longer feels empty. It feels withholding. And perhaps that is the best ending. Not a final revelation, but a final mood. The stones withheld their full answer from everyone who touched them, and yet they kept enough of it to force humility in anyone patient enough to look. The Sumerian builders may have been more brilliant than we were taught. They may also have been more dependent on inherited patterns than modern pride likes to allow. The old texts said the arts of order were taught. The engineering record shows that whoever taught them, or whatever traditions carried that teaching, the lessons took root deeply enough to remake the landscape. There is comfort in that distinction. We do not have to choose tonight between reverence and evidence. We can keep both in the room. The clay records their methods. The sacred stories record their memory of where method came from. Between those two witnesses, the night becomes very quiet, and in that quiet, the oldest builders seem less distant than they did when we began. Let the room go still with that. Let the old weight settle. Let the mystery remain intelligent. Let the stones keep their silence without becoming empty. And let the last thought be the gentlest and darkest one of all. That the earliest monuments of civilization may not mark the beginning of human knowledge, only the moment when inherited knowledge first became too large to hide. The question does not vanish. It simply learns how to rest without demanding a crude answer at once. Good night.